So let's talk about what the skeptics would say first, and then I'll show you why I think some of those views are worth hearing, but not convincing for me. Okay. So number one, skeptics who read the book of Daniel come to the book of Daniel with the a priori assumption that there is no God. Okay. If you believe there is no God, and then you read the book of Daniel and it projects itself as prophecy, well, if there's no God, or you're not sure, even agnostics, I want to be honest here, an agnostic, I don't know if there's a God, they would be skeptical because the book claims to be prophecy. Well, no one can really know the future, and especially if Daniel is detailed in foretelling the future, then we would call that into question, right? So our a priori assumptions matter, and so number one, the assumption, well, there's no God, thus Daniel can't be prophetic. Okay. The second is that there are parts of Daniel, the little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. There's sections of Daniel 11 and 12, well, 11 really, that seem to speak to the time period of the Maccabean revolt, which was a time when the Jews revolted against the Syrians under Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews, led by the Maccabees, the family of Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, they revolted against Syria and they overthrew them. And Israel won their independence. Oh, really? They had been under the thumb of Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, under Greece, and when Greece was divided up into, after the death of Alexander the Great, into the different regions that became known as kind of the Greek city-states, and then these major areas, including Syria and the area, the Ptolemies in the south in Egypt. What we find is that the Maccabean revolt has some affinity to the language of Daniel 7, 8, and 10. Really? When we see the little horn there, it kind of looks on the surface like some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did, right, in persecuting the Jews. And so scholars have said, well, see, the book of Daniel is all about the 2nd century BC. It's all about the 150s, 160s. And thus, because there's no such thing as prophecy, Daniel must have been living during that time, right? And he only pretended that he wrote the book earlier in order and used the name of Daniel to give himself some credibility. Okay. So the name Daniel does show up in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14. It mentions Job and it mentions Noah, and it says even if Job, Noah, and Daniel were in the land, they could only save themselves. They couldn't save the people around them because Israel has turned from me, right? So, and you can go back and read those sections on your own. But the argument is often made that, hey, how could Ezekiel name Daniel? How could he name him that early in his book when Daniel wouldn't necessarily have even had the reputation of wisdom yet? He still would have been a young man when Ezekiel was making these prophecies in the first half of his book, right? Yeah. So I think the best argument for that is, A, Daniel could have been a wise man even in Israel, a young man certainly, but he could have been a wise young man in Judah, in Jerusalem, before he was taken captive. Okay. He could have been known. That's the first thing. Yeah. The second is, I have no problem with Ezekiel when he's compiling all of his literature to put his book out, make it known, all of his writings, writing things back into that story. Mm-hmm. And I don't have any problem with that. It would be no problem for me if I'm writing a book and it takes me 40 years to write the book to go back and make edits earlier. That's not an issue. Some people say, oh, well, it had to be original for when he wrote it. That's not a problem for me. Not one bit of a problem. But nevertheless, the book of Daniel, even if I'm kind of getting into the arguments against the skeptics, but even if it was written in the 150s or 160s, even if it was, the prophecies of Daniel extend beyond Antiochus Epiphanes. They extend beyond the 200s AD or BC, and that needs to be wrestled with. Okay. Another argument that's often made is a literary one, and the literary one is that there are some words in the book of Daniel that show Persian influence, and they suggest, well, those Persian words would not have been known by Daniel and his friends, except that the book of Daniel certainly includes a time when Persian leadership took over, right, under Cyrus and Darius the Mede. And we can talk about those later. Cyrus and Darius might even be the same person. We'll talk about why that is. But those words certainly they're court words. They're words that would have been used in royal court language. So there's no question that those words are appropriate. The problematic words are the Greek ones. In chapter 3, it talks about all these instruments that are used in the worship of an image that gets set up, that everyone is forced to worship, and Daniel and his friends refuse to worship the image. And because they don't fall down when the music plays. They're thrown into a furnace, and they're supposed to be executed, and God saves them. But the list, there's this list of instruments there over and over. It lists both the number of satraps and governors and everybody who falls down or is supposed to fall down and worship the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then when you hear the music, when you hear the psaltery and the harp and the zither and the lyre, and it lists all these words, there's 3 Greek words that are names of instruments that come from Greece. And the argument is made that, well, there's no way Daniel writing in, let's say he wrote in the year 560, 550, 560, 570, somewhere in there. Let's say somewhere in there. There's no way that Daniel would have known those names of those instruments. So because Daniel couldn't have known them, they're Greek words. Greece came after the Medes and the Persians, so it really makes sense that Daniel would be using those words if he lived in the 2nd century, not 300 years, 400 years before. Okay. That's another argument they make. Yet another argument is that Daniel is not knowledgeable historically. He writes about people that have no basis in history, such as King Belshazzar, who's supposedly the son of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 5. Until recently, there was no evidence outside the biblical book of Daniel that there was such a guy. And so skeptical scholars through the 17 and 1800s, up till the mid-1800s, were adamant that Daniel simply made the name up. See, he doesn't know what he's talking about. If he'd lived back there during the time of Daniel or in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, he would have known that there's no such guy. He never would have made up such a name. So that's an argument that's often made. And that goes also for the name Darius the Mede in chapter 6. We don't know who Darius the Mede is. Yeah. There's no evidence for a guy named Darius the Mede who takes the throne at age 62. So who is that? It's like, that's interesting. And so because Daniel is making these historical statements and he gets them wrong, he certainly is from a later period, because if he lived at the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, he would have got those details right. Then there's some arguments made prophetically, and that is Daniel, he says he's apparently pointing to Antiochus Epiphanes, but he can't even get the details right of how long, the 2300 evening morning of Daniel 8 supposedly is, 2300 literal days where Antiochus would have this power and desolate the temple and the sanctuary. But that doesn't describe literally how long Antiochus took. So therefore, he doesn't even know the right events. He says he's predicting Antiochus Epiphanes, but he doesn't even get those events right. So not only is Daniel a prophet who's dated wrongly, he's attributing his name to a time when it didn't happen, he doesn't even get the events right of his own day. And so these are the arguments that skeptics bring out. And I hope I'm doing justice to their main arguments. There could be others as well. The fact that the book of Daniel is written in 2 different languages. It starts out in the book of in Hebrew language from chapter 1 up through 2 verse 3, 4, and then it switches to Aramaic, and it's in Aramaic all the way down to the end of chapter 7, and then it switches back to Hebrew for chapters 8 through 12. And scholars have said, well, that's evidence right there that Daniel's writing in Aramaic. Daniel would not have spoken Aramaic, early on back then. He would, Aramaic became the language of the Jews much later.
Interesting.
So those are the main arguments I think skeptics would say, And their first one drives a lot of the others. That is the assumption, the a priori assumption, there's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as prophecy, because that would be evidence of God. And I've already assumed and I have already accepted there is no God. Thus, Daniel can't be prophetic. If he's telling the future, then he's doing so on some method they have no idea about, and they simply reject that out of hand.